this on? Oh, okay, great. Well, my name is Rachel Hacker, and I'm here with the Flute View today, talking about my main topic. Now, this is a 3 or 4 part video series called Who is Afraid of the Kingma System Flute? A lot of times people see all of these keys right here, and they kind of freak out. And it's really a shame because there's a lot more of this instrument than you might think that there is. So I have started with my first installment with Robert Dick, and we talked about the creation of multiphonics, and we also talked about different ways you can use it for improvisation, some of the different features of his special instrument, and how he got involved in the Kingma System flute. So today I have Carla Rees with me, coming from the UK, and she teaches at Royal Holloway College of Music, and she also does Open College, which is a virtual online learning experience, and she also runs Rare Scale, her contemporary ensemble. So, Carla, let's talk about, particularly, I love your big flutes collection. You have big flutes that are Kingma flutes, and I think that's really cool. Now, is that one of them that you're holding right now?
Yeah, this is the alto flute. If I show you here, this is the most recent Kingma and Brannan collaboration, Kingma System alto. My first involvement with Kingma System was actually through the alto.
Wow.
Rather than C flute. And it happened because I was beginning to become very interested in playing the alto flute. There wasn't that much repertoire available. And I suddenly found very, very quickly that not having open holes on an alto was a major problem. I had all these composers that loved the sound, they wanted to write for it. But there was this big problem with extended techniques that you could hardly do anything with a closed hole instrument. And of course, no B-foot joint at that time either. So then I heard about Eva's work. I was doing my master's and researching the history of the alto flute development since Theobald Böhm, and heard about her work that she'd been doing to develop sort of open hole low flutes. And she has this, the amazing idea of the key-on-key system. And originally it all came through, and she was making an open hole bass flute.
Mm-hmm.
And the spaces between the keys are so big that she got around the system with this key-on-key, which was brilliant revolution.
Wow.
So in 2000 she made the first alto for me had the complete Kingma system, and of course it completely changed everything. I mean, changed my career, changed my whole approach, because suddenly not only did it have open holes, but with all the extra keys and all the extra possibilities for multiphonics and alternative fingerings and everything, made the alto flute a really exciting instrument.
Oh yeah.
And in terms of composers, they were so excited about being able to write for it. So, I mean, ever since then, people have keep being sent new pieces all the time. People that are just exploring it, trying to find what it can do. And then after the alto, I kind of moved on to the bass. This is the bass here. I have an upright. The bass is upright because obviously it helps with the breathing, it helps with all the positioning, but also
Absolutely.
because it has a B-foot joint as well, so it makes it extra useful. And this is at the moment, it's not quite finished, which is why it's not plated yet. It's made of brass.
Wow.
But eventually it will be silver plated.
And then Eva made this too, correct?
Yes.
What year is this from?
This is from, this is a difficult one. It's quite recent. It's about 2012, this one.
Wow.
And you can see with some of the keys, like for example, the F key, instead of having an open hole, there are 2 keys.
Yes.
So this is the E key.
Okay.
So that you have to hold down two keys instead of one to get to the small hole on the top. But it's a brilliant system. It's so logical. And I think for low flutes, it's made such a huge impact on what's possible with a repertoire. That's amazing.
Absolutely. It looks so complicated, but it's really quite simple once you break it down. Yep. One thing I'd like to rehash that Robert and I talked about is that no matter where you put any of these keys on the rotation of the body, it will have the same acoustical value as long as they're the same size, which is how we get away with good old inline G, something I'm sure all of you probably know about. So I think it's interesting that she's put roller keys in and all of these other modifications to
Well,
make it work.
I think one of the things that's amazing about Eva's work as a flute maker is how much time and effort she spends on the ergonomics. So, for example, with the alto, I mean, there's a lot of things like the positioning of the holes. If you see the open holes, they're positioned exactly so that they fit under my fingers.
Absolutely.
And she really goes to great effort to make it comfortable to play. So a lot of the work we've been doing, I'll work with composers, they'll talk about particular fingerings like multiphonics or something, and how flexible they are and how easy it is to be able to get around the instrument. And then if there are any problems, I go back to Eva and she can slightly modify the hand positions. And that's how we learn about what you need from the instrument, and it keeps developing and evolving all the time, which is super exciting.
Oh, that's so exciting.
Yeah. And I think that the important thing is, I mean, the alto flute, this is my main instrument. I play it all the time. I play all repertoire on it, not just contemporary repertoire. And it has to be comfortable to be able to play it for a long time. You know, it has to be well balanced. Everything has to work very well. And I think it's such a logical fingering system. I mean, I've been playing Kingma System now for 16 years. And I don't think about it. I mean, it's just completely intuitive, the fingering system, and everything just it's so normal. It's just like playing a normal flute. It doesn't feel like it's kind of got extra challenges. It just has more possibilities.
That's how I feel about my flute, is it's the same thing. I've had this a whopping 3 weeks, and in that time I've already figured out just how much it actually makes sense, where the extra keys are. You know, it's easy to look at something. I'm going to show where the B and the B flat cluster is, and on first look you might look at that and say, wow, isn't that crazy? But then you see how you can press this and how you can press that to get the quarter tone, or how you can press this and then go to that for the C. What would that be? The B quarter sharp? Yes. So just with all of those kind of ergonomics, it makes sense. You slide anyways from your B to your B flat, so why can't we slide upwards? Why can't we slide downwards?
And I think it also teaches you a lot about how to approach the flute in terms of hand positions and that kind of thing. Because, you know, we learn at the beginning a hand position is a fixed place and you put your fingers in exactly the places your teacher tells you and you're not supposed to move. But I think one of the wonderful things about the Kingma system is it encourages you to move in different positions, and you learn so much about how to play the flute just from having to explore all these different positions, different tunings, different, you know, all the possibilities. It just always enhances kind of musical skills.
Absolutely.
And the other thing, when I got my first alto, Kingma System alto, I picked it up from Eva over the weekend. And then on the Monday morning, I had a recording session where they asked me to play, you know, quarter tone scales and things. And at that time, there wasn't really a fingering system developed. I mean, that obviously, otherwise everybody could learn it, but there were no charts written out for the Kingma system or anything like that. So I had no reference point. And I just literally, it took me a weekend to learn the fingerings. It was that easy just to sort of pick it up, because everything's based on sharpening a normal pitch. So if you're always thinking about going up from a normal pitch, it's very easy to find the places and the fingerings. You get used to it so quickly.
I like that idea. I really like just thinking about it in terms of the upwards. I think with the key system and how it works is, yes, there's no real fingering charts, but one thing that's perhaps a shortcoming of how we teach the flute is we don't teach the flute in terms of the order of the tone holes. We teach the flute in terms of the fingerings themselves. You know, if you play something like F, look at all the keys that come down. You have all this extra stuff coming down. You have a B flat that's here, which brings this down, and it just makes zero sense. So going off of that, I think if we retaught perhaps how we play the flute to our younger generation in that terms of where are the tone holes, they would understand Kingma systems a lot more clearly.
Yeah, but I think, you know, the system itself is so designed for playing, for being able to be played. It's not,
absolutely,
you know, it's not like an academic exercise. The whole thing came out of something a player wanted to achieve, you know, and Eva has worked the whole time with different players, with, you know, bringing their own ideas to it and their own kind of solutions to particular problems that they encounter along the way. And I think this whole kind of relationship between the music and the players and the maker is really important because it all evolves together. And, you know, there are things that I can do musically that I could never have dreamt of before because I have the Kingma system. And the composers I work with are just completely mind blown by these instruments that, you know, suddenly there are all these extra possibilities. And I actually have worked with a lot of composers who've developed their own complete harmonic systems based on having an instrument that can do what they really want it to do. And then, of course, the instrument evolves based on the things the composers are asking us to play as well. So there's this amazing kind of organic development, which I think is really exciting, and it's really shaping the future of what what music is going to be. It's amazing.
I love what you said about like the organic nature of the collaboration. I think for me, just starting off on my Kingma System journey, it's very interesting to see that currently, and you know, I want to ask you if you agree with this, it seems like many of our best Kingma System composers are also flutists, and being able to transition that over into Kingma System composers that know what they need to do to compose well for it.
That's an interesting one. Most of the composers that I work with are not flute players.
Okay, wow.
I work with a lot of composers who write in microtonal languages. I mean, actually, this is another thing that's amazing about the Kingma system is that different players use it for different things. And the kind of evolution of what I use it for has become more about microtonal music. And that comes partly from the types of composers that I've been working with. There are lots of composers that I work with who are based on sort of spectral styles. So they're using the harmonic series to create kind of their own musical harmonic language. So that it's very naturally occurring language. I mean, the harmonic series, you can't get more kind of, you know, attached to nature than that in terms of the physical properties of sound. And if you go to the very high harmonics in the series, they're microtonally pitched.
Yes.
So these composers build their music on very low fundamentals so that the highest harmonics are around the range of the flute. And so that means that the microtones that I'm playing feel completely part of the language they're writing in. They don't sound like kind of out of tune notes, and they don't sound like, you know, people kind of, the perception of microtones is that they're just kind of normal notes but a bit out of tune. But actually with some of this music you can get to the situation where if you play a normal note it sounds really strange because it doesn't fit with the harmonic series that they're writing in. And there actually have been a few composers that have done kind of whole research projects and PhDs and things on developing harmonic systems using Kingma system flutes. And I think that's really interesting because it's them, they're involving their own sort of creative output based on what the instrument can do. I think there are a lot of flute player composers that own Kingma system instruments that do their own investigation.
Yes.
But I think, yeah, the majority of the composers that I work with are not flute players.
That's very interesting. I respect that they are willing to take on the challenge of not just, you know, coming up with something with some microtones, but something that really has clout and has its own language with it. That's a really beautiful thought process.
But I think a lot of it as well for these composers, they're not so interested in necessarily how the sounds are produced, but they use it as a way of just developing their imaginations. Because if they're suddenly told, you know, let's say some composer wants to write an alto flute piece, you know, they'll come along and they'll say, okay, so what can you do on this instrument? And the trouble with a standard alto flute, if it has closed holes, they'll say, well, what about multiphonics? And it's kind of like, well, there aren't very many because you've only got closed holes. And then they sort of think about other techniques, and things like timbral trills get used a lot in compositions because they're such an amazing sound. But you know, if you're on a closed hole instrument, you're limited with the number of possibilities of timbral trills, alternative fingerings, all those kind of things. So composers come along and they say, okay, well, can you do these things? And then you sort of say, well, not really, because it's a standard alto flute, doesn't really do that. And then they get really disappointed. So suddenly you say to them, yeah, I can do all of that, plus I can do these extra things. They get really super excited.
Oh, of course.
And for them, it's just suddenly it's like fuel to their imagination. And quite often what happens in the process of collaborating is they write their kind of, you know, wildest dreams music. They write what they would love to hear. And then my job is to work out how to make that possible. Mm-hmm. And I made, as part of my PhD, I made websites about each of the Kingma system low flute, alto and bass. Fingering charts, videos, sound files, notational examples, just basically everything a composer would want to know. And that's been really useful because it takes the first stage out of the collaboration. Because usually with a collaboration, they want to know what the instrument can do. And then they forget half of it because there's so much to take in that it's just kind of, it takes a while. So it's like they have a reference tool that's there for them all the time. So now I'm getting pieces where they've already looked at the fingering charts and they've already looked at kind of, if they want a multiphonic trill, they've looked at, well, there's this one and this finger moves, and they've figured all that out for themselves. And so when they bring it to me, it's just testing and seeing what we can do and then seeing how we can extend it a bit further as well.
Wow.
Things maybe they haven't thought of. It's a really exciting process. And the repertoire is changing all the time because the more I get to know the instruments, the more I've got to help them with, and the more their sort of ideas also flow together. So we get some really exciting things coming out.
Oh, of course.
And also music in really lots of different styles, which I think is also very interesting. I with my publishing company, I try and publish as many Kingma System pieces as I can, because I think it's important that people know, actually there is repertoire available for these instruments. But the interesting thing for me is the kind of the middle ground, because there are pieces that have to be played on a Kingma System instrument because, for example, they use a multiphonic which has a key that if you played it on a standard instrument, the key wasn't there, so you couldn't play it.
Yeah.
And there are other composers who want, for example, absolutely even sounding perfect quarter tones that don't have any difference in tone color or dynamic response, that they sound just the same as all the other notes, so they'll write specifically for Kingma System. But there are lots of other pieces that the composers start out writing for Kingma System, and their idea is to just sort of try a thing, see how far it goes, and then quite often they'll make two different versions of the piece. So there'll be a Kingma System version, which is their sort of ideal, and then they'll sort of imagine how you can adapt those extra techniques that you can develop because you've got all the extra key work, and try and find ways of making it work on a standard flute. So then it becomes about the Kingma System also driving repertoire for standard flute and showing how you can sort of lead from the front and then kind of find a way of adapting it, which is also really interesting.
How amazing. I mean, it's so fascinating to see that we still have composers pushing forward. I think there's many times people will say almost that we've reached the end, or that I don't know where else to push thing, and to still have the mind be active in terms of where can we push this next, to still find that room to grow is so great.
And I think actually that's one of the amazing things about the Kingma System, because it gives composers a kind of, there's an extra dimension for them to work with, it's sort of more possibilities that they hadn't really thought about, or for example, a multiphonic that might be really important to their harmonic scheme that you couldn't do without the extra keys, which I think is really interesting, just being able to do that. And also, tone quality, the expressive quality of the instruments are amazing. That's one thing actually that I find most striking about the Kingma System, is that because you've got all these extra keys that give you kind of really even quarter tones, there's no change in dynamic range. Normally if you have to do on a closed hole instrument, if you have to play a quarter tone, you have to do some strange fingering and then roll the flute to a different angle. And, and it's not quite in tune. But more importantly, the expressive range is limited because you're having to roll in the flutes in a different position. But the fact that you can do all of these techniques and also be incredibly expressive about it, I think is really crucial. And especially on low flutes, where actually the quiet end of the dynamic is really special. And the kind of flexibility of tone colours and things, and the fact that I can play really in-tune microtones and also have that level of expression. I think that for composers, you could, just write a piece that doesn't use any of the extra keys particularly, but just using that sort of range of expression and the sort of microtonal tunings and things. I think it's very useful.
Absolutely. It's just so fascinating to see how people are pushing the flute, and there's so many different corners of the globe that I'm discovering where we are still evolving this instrument. We are still figuring out, I mean, I guess you could say in a negative sense it's shortcomings, but then being able to turn those into a new project, into a new endeavor.
Yeah. But I think actually the other thing that flute players often forget is the fact that, the Kingma System flute as a quarter tone instrument, I mean, people call it a quarter tone flute, it's much more than that, but even just on that very basic level as a quarter tone instrument, it's leading the way ahead of all other instruments. There is now a quarter tone oboe that's been developed relatively recently, but composers come to the flute to write for it because it's one of the most advanced in terms of what it can actually do, and technology, and the system and the logic of it.
I've always had a theory that perhaps because we have the open half of our mouth open, it's almost like we can do more because we are physically able to use our mouth more. Some of the other instruments are really limited by having their entire embouchure occupied with the instrument. We have a whole top lip that's free, completely free. So I think that's part of why, but I agree with you.
But also having such a logical key system in terms of what Boehm did originally.
Yeah.
Very, very logical, well thought out system. So we were already at a point where there's a system that can be developed further. And then the work that Eva's done is really groundbreaking. So, a lot of the composers that I work with have tried writing microtonal music for strings and often find that the intonation is a little bit, because it's all based on feel. There's always a big problem if something you're doing is based on feel, because it's hard to remember exactly how far, a finger has to move or something. It's the same as if we're doing pitch bends and things. It's very hard to kind of be absolutely precise about exactly how much it moves and keeping it exactly the same every time.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
But with this whole idea of being able to have extra keys and a key on top of a key, it's a much more sort of exact and precise science. So it means that when you're playing things, it's much more easy to be perfectly in tune on a quarter tone because all the holes are in the right places, and it's you can adapt as you would with any pitch in terms of the intonation and that kind of thing. But it sort of puts us ahead of the other instruments, and I think there possibly will be a time when other instruments develop in the same way. People will see what's been possible on the flute and try and adapt that for other instruments. It could happen.
That's really fascinating. I think so many things, as you've talked about, will just continue to blossom and move it. And I think I think you're doing a very good job advocating for what the Kingma flute can do, and again, making people less afraid of the Kingma System flute. Before we go, I would like to talk about your publishing company and the work you've done for it, because I think the most crucial part, as we've talked about, of getting the Kingma flute taken seriously is less of a novelty and more of a serious pursuit, is having the repertoire in place. So I know you've brought a piece of music with you today.
I do.
And tell us about who wrote this piece. Tell us about what this is.
Well, this is an alto flute piece. This is called Les Heures Bleues by Michael Oliver. He's a British composer. I've worked with him for the last sort of 15 years, collaborating on all sorts of repertoire. He's one of the best composers I know for low flute music, because what he does is he has a very instinctive sense of what the instruments can do and the sound of them. And a lot of his kind of harmonic writing, he's a microtonal composer, but he's also very heavily influenced by people like Debussy. So there's this amazing sense of it. It's almost romantic, but it also happens to be microtonal, some of it, not all of it. But this piece, I'm very pleased to say, won was a finalist in the NFA newly published music competition last year. And as far as I know, that's the only Kingma System piece that has been in that competition. I don't know for sure, but I think it's. And this is a piece for Kingma System alto. And just to give you some idea about the sort of music. So if you see at the beginning, I don't know how clear that is, but
just a little closer, I think, Carla. Great.
He's using multiphonics as part of his kind of harmonic language. So he works out the harmonies he's going to use and then goes from single line to multiphonics in a way that, most multiphonic composers would do. You see this kind of thing happening in Robert Dick's music, various other people. But he uses certain combinations of notes within the multiphonics, which are Kingma System. So you can see, I think it's the second one down. I think there's in the fingering diagram, there's a C with a little hat, which means quarter tone higher. So it just gives you an idea. The reason this is a Kingma System piece is because he's using multiphonics that use those particular keys. But we're also working on a version that might work for a standard system alto flute. But the thing that I think is really important with publishing this kind of music is, okay, there might not be that many people right now that have Kingma System alto flutes, but it's only going to keep growing.
Oh, yes.
You know, you have to start somewhere. A lot of the repertoire, I mean, the whole idea behind my publishing company was that I'd worked with, I lost count of the number of pieces, but it's hundreds of pieces that have been written since I started this project with the alto flute, trying to develop repertoire. And some of the pieces get performed a lot by me with my ensemble rare scale. For example, there's another piece of Michael's that's called Apparition and Release, and we've performed that well over 50 times. You know, and the pieces get played. But then I had this massive house fire and all the music disappeared. And there was some composers that I had the only copy of various pieces because they'd given it to me and then they'd lost their notes or whatever. And so I was really determined to make sure that the music was available and it didn't get lost again. So that was kind of the whole idea behind the publishing company, and trying to make low flute music more available, because, you know, a lot of the mainstream publishers, because they'll see the market as being potentially quite small, it's growing all the time. But for some of them, it doesn't make commercial sense to sell lots of low flute music. So that was kind of the original idea. But I mean, I have lots of pieces written for me that are for Kingma System instruments, and I don't see why they should be treated any differently from the other pieces. You know, it's like I've done arrangements of Bach cello suites for alto flute, and that's great, but some of them have low B in them, with osiers, but I do my arrangements with low Bs on alto because I have a low B on my alto. But, you know, if the repertoire exists, it's this whole thing, again, going full circle with the maker and the repertoire. If the repertoire exists, the makers will create the instruments. And if players know that there is a whole massive heap of repertoire that's really interesting music, really well written, that it's for all kinds of different flutes, you know, C for closed hole altos, B for open hole altos, Kingma System, whatever. It's about showing what's available and showing what some people are doing. So I have other players will often send me repertoire that's been written for them as well, so we can kind of, between us, working together to get the repertoire out and show people what's possible. I think it's really important. And the way the company is set up is that actually it's more or less non-profit making. So a percentage of all the sales goes into performance of these pieces, and the composers get a really relatively high proportion of the money as well. So that it's to support the composers. That's really what it's for.
That's great. We definitely need to support our composers and continue to give them lots of assurance that they are doing things that are interesting and in a certain niche, maybe instead of what's trendy. Yeah. And I think there's something that they always talk about in new music, about the second performance, and how many pieces are given a single performance in new music and possibly not resurfaced either ever again and the piece is somewhat scrapped, or it takes a very long time before someone finds the music again. But the longer the piece goes without being performed again, the less likely in some ways it will resurface. So I think you've got a really great system. Well, I'd like to thank you so much for talking to the Flute View today. I think you brought a lot of great insights into what new music is about these days and to make it maybe a less scary thing. And I think to perhaps pave the way for what future generations can do with Kingma flutes, with some kind of crazy, I don't know, eighth of a tone flute existing 100 years from now, to think of just all the different directions we can move the flute into. So I'm going to turn off the camera, but thank you again for taking this time to talk to the Flute View.
Thank you.